Okay, so for context to the listener, Ethan and I were just talking about what we were going to talk about. And originally we were going to talk about corrective exercise, which we still might end up doing today. But we began talking about the whole length and partial business that is currently going on in the industry and just the technicalities of sort of what's going on almost more culturally than anything else. I think it is going to be an interesting frame to discuss it on the level on. Like I think you are maybe a little bit more familiar with like some of the research based stuff on this topic than I am. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of start with here is just this general trend toward or this general pendulum swing toward making everything in every possible way more stretched focused, more lengthened focused, both in terms of the positions that we're training, so the joint positions and the muscle lengths, obviously, but also in terms of like where we put resistance in an exercise. So we've talked, you and I, before about, resistance profiles and strength profiles, which are terms that come from RTS and Tom Purvis, which basically describe, that you have the ability to manipulate where in a motion resistance is higher and or lower, and then you also have an ability to change your position in a way that is, you stretching a muscle more or you stretching a muscle relatively less. And those are sort of different things, and a lot of people have been combining those topics and either conflating them or basically just saying that the more lengthened that you can get an exercise, the better. And the more heavier that you can make an exercise in that length of position, the better. And so I think whenever we start to see this heavy momentum based trend toward a particular topic, it's very important to check in on like, okay, what things are we just blatantly ignoring right now? Because, and something that I use as a barometer, if that's a correct term to use or phrase to use, for like what people are talking about and what people are sort of getting indoctrinated into or sucked into sort of in a non-educated way, is like what kind of question am I very consistently getting, and how nuanced is the question? So as it relates to this particular topic, the kind of question that I get more and more is, well, why would you do this one exercise if you could get a better stretch on this one? Or why would you use this portion of the range when you could get a better stretch? Isn't a better stretch better, or isn't a greater stretch better? Isn't more resistance in the stretch better, and all those sorts of things? So when the questions become more black and white, and when they get shorter and shorter and more convinced and more certain in a given direction, I think it is incumbent upon the people that really deeply care about just the nuances of this stuff to introduce things that are not necessarily just counter arguments for the sake of it, but just other relevant factors to consider in the context of training, and other factors that we should really continue to pay attention to and to not forget about. So that's just kind of the more cultural side of it that I wanted to come from, is just addressing that on a broad scale. But I'm interested in where you wanted to start in terms of more specifics, maybe with kind of what you were just describing before we hit record about just the body of literature and the amount of evidence that we maybe actually have in relationship to the way that people are communicating it.
Yeah, yeah, that was a good intro. I think it really encapsulates this idea of like whether you're listening to a podcast right now or whether you have a client or like a virtual consultation, there just seems to be so many people that start with the phrase like, let's get a muscle as long as possible and let's load it the heaviest in that position. And if we're doing something that takes away from that, it's less than optimal. So to your point, a lot of clients will say, for example, like, well, if I, add a band to a squat or a leg press, will that be a reverse band, or whether that be a band in the opposite direction? Isn't that taking load away from the most lengthened position? Therefore, isn't it bad? And I think just that very like binary way of thinking is, something in general that the more advanced you become, the more mature you become as, either an athlete or a science communicator, um, that you can start to become a little bit more nuanced in and understand why, when, where, who this applies to. So it seems like this rhetoric has come a lot from the research looking at ranges of motion and sort of what's most stimulative for hypertrophy. So initially the body of evidence really pointed to the idea that like a full range of motion is better than a partial range of motion when it comes to stimulating hypertrophy longitudinally across time. And when that data was reanalyzed, it was reanalyzed through the lens of, well, where is that partial range of motion? And this is always cool, like when we think we really understand a topic, and then again, we're able to become more nuanced and realize, much like we were talking about in the back pain episode, that things need to be subcategorized.
Mm.
And so many times we have a strong opinion on something because we don't understand how to subcategorize it. So this is a great example of, where there were, t-shirts and slogans and all sorts of stuff around like, full range of motion, is the best, and there wasn't even really an understanding of what is full range of motion, what does that mean, like all the things we talked about I think in the last episode of what's the technique, what's the execution, what's a setup. There's so much context to what is full range of motion, and we've went into that a little bit. And then this topic of, again, like um, what range are we talking about when we're talking about partial, and where is the tension in that range, which is still something that often gets missed. So, and then putting those together, and really at this point, we're still speculating in a lot of ways. So, we talk about resistance profile on this podcast because we're going with the basic understanding of just like being in a given range. If there's no tension there, does not necessarily mean that like you're getting stimulus out of being there. And you could say like, well, we need more and more studies to support the idea that like resistance profile is important. But I think there's a lot of other you know areas we could look at to say like, well, we know that we need tension. Like we know that if I'm doing a bicep curl with no weight in my hand, and I'm a trained subject, that like that's probably not going to be you know sufficiently stimulative for hypertrophy. So I need load somewhere, and then from there, like as we just start to break out into logical conclusions, it's like, well, if we get into a position that we want to stimulate, we still need load, we still need tension there. So there's some sort of seemingly obvious conclusions, we can come to, and then some that are maybe like more of a stretch. Um,
Mm.
so we've broken it up now into saying like, okay, we have this meta-analysis that says like full range of motion is better than partial range of motion, but later on we realized like, oh well, all partials are not created equal. And then this new body of literature starts coming out in parallel to another body of literature, one that's looking at like doing partial range of motion in a lengthened position, and another body of literature looking at long duration stretching and its effects on hypertrophy. And with these two bodies of literature sort of growing, simultaneously, and I would say that like the number of studies like directly looking at like, lengthened partial versus full range of motion is still like in the single digits. It's still very low. It's still like, yes, like there's a slight trend, but we have, fairly limited data. And realize like there are things again that you and I are coming to like logical conclusions on based on like, if you could do more work somewhere because you're stronger there and it's a position that you want to train, well, the fundamental reasoning that we come to is like um, train a muscle through the range that you can control and load it with appropriate tension there, and it's like if we're just following that basic principle of just like take a muscle through the entire range that you can control it in and load it appropriately. And the word appropriately to me would just simply mean like if you can do more in a given range than you can in another range, it probably then is reasonable to assume that you would load that heavier than the range you were weaker in. So what's happened, with this, with these bodies of literature saying like, okay, we can stimulate some degree of hypertrophy, mostly looking at untrained subjects, looking at super long duration stretches. And it's like we can stimulate some hypertrophy just, stretching a muscle. And it's, equal to a like moderate amount of volume in training. And then we say, oh, there's also some research to support the idea that maybe doing lengthened partials is as effective or possibly more effective than doing the full range under the conditions that it's been studied. And then we take this, body of literature, and now all of a sudden people are, in the gym. Let's say, that same like 16-year-old kid we talked about, like doing partial range of motion, back squats in earlier episodes, kind of like that archetype, who's just like, high school football player, maybe like gets their information from TikTok or something. And now all of a sudden, like this kid's in the locker room, talking about like we need to get into a deep stretch and make things heaviest there. And I think like overall, it's really cool that like there is locker room talk like that going on. Like I think that's an exciting thing.
Mhm.
And there can be some pushback from the old heads where it's like, oh, just train hard, eat a lot of food, don't worry about the details. But overall, like even though there are some negatives that come out of it, I think it's exciting that people are just interested
Mhm.
in the details. But with that being said, um, where you end up with is just like we start to throw things out where it's like doing things where we start to add additional load in what we might consider a shorter position, setting up exercises where it maybe takes some load off in a longer position. That is just across the board negative, and more is better. Can we get into more of a stretch? Can we put more load there? And for myself, I just come back to that concept again of like, go, train your full available range that you can control, and load that range appropriately.
Mhm.
So, yes, if you can control, whether it be a high degree of knee flexion, elbow flexion, whatever that is, if you can control that range, I think you should go there. And then this next point about like, appropriate load, I think is a really big one. And I think if you just extend this idea of like heavier far enough, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So I think if you go to the point of like looking at it from, an absolute standpoint where it's not heavier relative to how strong you are, it's not simply just like, if we're stronger in a given position, we may load it heavier there so that we're kind of like having a matched resistance to our strength, but we just say no, screw being matched, let's just make it as heavy as possible in the most long position. I think if you naturally just extend that out, you get to the point where it's like, okay, we're so heavy in this position and we have almost no tension in the rest of the range that the time you're spending under significant tension really starts to go down. And I'm not saying that's what people are doing in practice, because the reality is like it would be pretty hard to actually set something up like that. Um, but what I see as a general trend is just that like when you're using that logic, you do start to extend it to areas that don't necessarily make sense. So for example, someone might say like you get more hypertrophy out of training the eccentric than you do the concentric, which I think is actually more debatable than people realize. Like when the research accounts for total work being done, there really doesn't seem to be that much of a difference. And I very much question whether that's going to be a similar thing with the length and partials as well. if it's like, oh yeah, eccentrics are so much better than concentrics, well, just simply because the way that we're studying it, we're allowing people to do more work. We're
Hmm.
allowing people to generate more attention, but then when you account for that, it sort of goes away. So I'm curious if that ends up being sort of a similar case here. But then what someone might do with that information is they might say, well, then I'm going to, maximally slow down the eccentric. And because the length in position is also the most important, I'm going to pause really long in that position. And it's funny because this is something that in practice, I would do, but for, maybe different reasons. Because, when you look at the actual research in terms of like really slowing down an eccentric maximally, or pausing in that position, you don't actually see more hypertrophy because the reality is you're actually generating higher peak forces if you have to move faster, decelerate, and change direction.
Hmm.
So again, just I'm trying to like create a logic here and say, all right, well, now let's extend that concept to just make something as heavy as possible in the most length and position. If the whole idea is to generate the most total like tension under the curve, the most, force under the curve over time, you may very much be throwing the baby out with the bathwater by saying like, let's just make it the heaviest at this one moment in time. And even if I was stronger in other positions, because people then get confused when they say, well, you're stronger in the lengthened position, but they take the exercise out of the equation. So if you were doing, a squat or a bench press, for example, they take the idea of, they lose this concept of like sort of stack joints at the top, where it's like, well, it doesn't necessarily apply to multi joint lifts, even though you might see that represented, in a single joint lift. So they're just say, all right, squat, bench press, whatever. Like we're never going to set these up, to have more, more tension, or more, resistance in, what they consider like a shorter position for a muscle, because they're going with this idea of longer is stronger and longer is better. When in fact, if the equation is just simply like total tension, total force, area under the curve, you may be actually throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't know. I feel like that was just something that was on my mind that I kind of wanted to like just say out loud. I'm just like thinking about it, on a walk, thinking about it walking around the house. So I feel like we just kind of use this podcast to like get shit off of our head, like in real time.
Hmm. Yeah. So I have a lot to say, so you're in luck. Um, so first things first, I wanted to give an example of one of the things that you were alluding to, just about the way that we conduct specific research in describing this recent study or semi-recent study that came out and was sort of blasted on all sort of science-based corners of social media, which was a study comparing seated and standing calf raises. I don't know how old it is, but as you might guess, the conclusion was basically like, or really the conclusion that people took away and extracted from the study, which they probably didn't read, was standing calf raises are much better than seated calf raises, and we shouldn't really be doing seated calf raises because standing calf raises stretch the gastroc more, and everyone wants to grow the gastroc because God forbid, you grow you grow your soleus, as if like that's how it worked in general. And so what people have done through no fault of their own, I've had this conversation, I think, at minimum like 5 times in the last 2 weeks, just about this specific study and like why seated calf raise is still like an appropriate thing to be doing. And I just try to basically describe this idea that, and anyone could do this on a seated calf raise if you have access to one, is like use a weight that you can do a full range of motion with, whatever you're labeling as full range of motion in your head. And what you'll notice is that if you use full range of motion, again, in this context, just being you're going as low as you can dorsiflex and as high as you can plantar flex in that given position, with the accompanied foot motion, what you'll notice is that you will get to a point where you're fatiguing, but you're really only fatiguing in like the top 20-30% of the range, right? So you go through the range of motion and you get to a point where, ooh, it's starting to burn. Ooh, the reps are starting to slow, and you get just sort of pinned toward the top. And then people stop the set, right? Or maybe even before that point when they can't get the last like 10% of the rep because, if they're not doing full range, then what are they doing, kind of a thing. And then you look at someone do a normal standing calf raise, and what they're kind of doing in that, regardless of whether they're doing, what people think of as full range or not, is in a standing calf raise, generally speaking, when people do reps, they tend not to go to the extreme of the short position, just for reasons that are more like technically nuanced than I think is worth getting into. And so what they end up doing is really just their full range is usually like the bottom 50% or maybe 60% of what they potentially could use. So you are creating a study in which you're using an exercise with just way less total force involved, and also where you're not fatiguing like the lengthened half of the range, like you're not using a weight that's appropriate to challenge that portion of the range, as you were just discussing. And then you're comparing it to an exercise where you're essentially doing a lengthened partial. So you're comparing an exercise which has more stretch in a muscle and which you are challenging through much more of the total range of motion, lengthened or shortened, sort of not even part of that conversation. If you just broke this down to how much of the range are you fatiguing, I think this would end up being a very different conversation. So, how you might change that in setting up a study would be like, just using the same sort of measured degrees of ankle motion. We'll say like in the bottom half of both the seated calf raise and the standing calf raise, or maybe just the top half, because I guarantee you that the results, well, I can't guarantee any result, right? But the results would more than likely be very different than comparing basically what is a shortened partial to a lengthened partial and a motion that is, a stretch versus not stretch exercise. And then that's not even accounting for the fact that that may look completely different in someone who has been doing both of those exercises for even a couple months, right? That the outcome that you might see over a 12-week period may completely change depending on, as you and I have talked about before, what the exposure to those exercises is of the participants before, they conduct the study. What if you're dealing with people who have been doing standing calf raises for a very long time or have never done a standing calf raise and they only have been doing seated calf raises, right? Those are things to consider as well. But I just thought that was one example of like an instance where you see this comparison that is very biased in the way that it's set up, accidentally, usually. Biased in the direction of favoring, the long length situation, just as a product of like what the mechanics of the exercise are. It would kind of be like if you were to compare a bench press, to a fly, where the fly was only like really loaded in the short position, and then saying that you should never do the fly because, the bench press produced a better outcome, when in reality it was just like, well, if you loaded the bench press differently or with a different implement, and you loaded the fly differently, or, maybe in the like a machine-based context, outcomes could be very different. And I think what we're sort of returning back to in both of our points here is just like trying to take a step back and to look at it from the 30,000 foot, like more principle-based view of like, okay, what are the sorts of like basic physics of the situations that we're actually setting up and looking at, and then what might we expect based on the mechanics of the things that are set up. Because I think for most people who really have delved deeply into the mechanics stuff, you realize that like just oftentimes the way that we set up the exercise is sort of what creates what we'll say a better or worse outcome in terms of hypertrophy. As in, the calf study, like if you compared, the a lengthened partial and the seated calf raise to just the traditional standing calf raise, the outcome may be different, right? Just to sort of harken back to that example. And one of the things that I heard Broderick Chavez say some time ago, and I'm sure this has been said before he said it, but just this concept that like science is not based on fact, it's based on support. And I think that when you're talking about a topic that has fewer than 10 studies done on it, what we can say is that there is a little bit of support potentially in the direction or in favor of a specific strategy, but it should not be communicated as it is currently being communicated as fact and as the best thing that you should do, right? Because that not only removes it from any sort of context, but it also, in terms of actual scientific rigor, is, I think, something that is inherently anti-scientific to communicate this idea that we have figured this thing out and that this is what you should do, which doesn't mean that you shouldn't, feel comfortable providing some kind of skeptical recommendation about training. I think that's totally fine, but just to make sure that you contextualize it and say, look, as you're saying, don't throw this, whole thing out just because we're seeing some evidence in favor of it. And I think that, unfortunately, have you heard of the term or the phrase audience capture?
No.
So it's a term or a phrase that's coined by this guy Eric Weinstein, and it's basically this idea that when you are someone who is, we'll say, on social media and you have built up an audience, um, that audience comes to expect particular things of you as a creator. And when you become known for a particular topic, whether it be science-based communication or a specific topic within that sort of umbrella term, your audience comes to expect that you communicate about a particular topic in a specific biased sort of a way. So what happens is if you communicate as the creator with your audience and you build up your audience based on this principle or this idea, let's say you become known for doing an exercise, then you're going to be known as the guy that does this exercise. And any time that you stray away from being the guy that does that exercise, your audience is like, dude, like, what the fuck? You're the guy that does that exercise. Why aren't you doing that exercise? You said that like this exercise was the best. So it's this self-reinforcing positive feedback loop of creator who gets rewarded for talking about a specific topic in a specific way, who generally makes strong claims about that thing, who then when he or she repeats or regurgitates that story, he gets rewarded for it, right? So again, his audience finds him or her based on this, him doing this exercise, and they get rewarded for it. And so what it does is it creates this unfortunate loop wherein if the creator steps outside the bounds of what they've previously said they subscribe to, they get punished by questions about like, wait, but you said this thing. And wait, but I thought that this thing was the best the whole time. And all of that is really just born of not taking a step back and not taking, I think, a little bit more of a principle-based approach, which is to say that like, hey, this is what we currently know, and this is what we recommend based on what we currently know, but don't throw this other stuff out. That would be a more principle-based way to do it. But that's not what we are currently seeing, to the frustration of, I think, both of us. And it's leading people in directions that, from an education perspective, are helpful to no one, right? Because all that's sort of happening is just like this sort of soundbite science, if we want to call it that, that just gets continually less refined and continually more and more nebulous as the message sort of telephones along. So this idea of audience capture, I think, is a big problem when it comes to these topics because it puts creators in certain buckets. I mean, they themselves are doing it. And what it does is it makes it more difficult for that person to actually be able to step outside of that bucket and be like, wait, no, I wasn't right about this thing. No one wants to admit to thousands of people that like, I was totally full of shit about this topic, or, hey, I was wrong, which is just an unfortunate consequence, like I said, of all those different things. So I wanted to kind of get into just a different aspect of, some of the things that you touched on, because I do have more to say about the specifics. Did you want to make just a commentary? Did anything come to mind as I was going through any of that?
Yeah, I think there's also the concept of how these things interact with each other. So, in science, we have to isolate specific factors. And, sometimes, or when you do that, you often lose ecological validity. So, the one benefit of doing a study just looking at like seated calf raise versus standing calf raise is that result will probably be true in practice for most people. That, again, that 16-year-old football player goes into the gym and he can do one exercise, in this imaginary scenario, standing calf raise or seated calf raise. Chances are, without any other information, he'll get more growth out of doing the standing calf
Yeah.
raise. So, with more context, with more time, with more options, with more knowledge, like that can be controlled for, but at least it has an ecological validity of like in practice for most people without any other knowledge, that's probably the way that it'll go. Um, but you also have to take into account when you just look at one factor, we don't have a clear idea of how these things interact. So we don't necessarily know, how far that extends. Like how many set, like just as an example, not saying this is the case, but just as like a thought experiment, like, is it possible that you could get to a number of standing calf raises where the amount of hypertrophy started to level out, and that doing more standing calf raises wouldn't necessarily measurably increase your hypertrophy, but maybe that doing more seated calf raises on top of that would actually give you additional benefit. This is just isn't something that we fully know at this point. We can speculate maybe from like an orthopedic perspective, again coming back to that concept of just like training your available range, that could be beneficial. um, but we don't necessarily know from a hypertrophy aspect like how these variables interact. And I don't think, and I think it's a reasonably safe bet to kind of, like many other things, sort of hedge that bet and say like, well, let's sort of spread the volume out a little bit. Maybe we even bias it based on this information, but we still kind of hedge our bets on saying like, all right, we're still going to do, a little bit of these other things as well. And that might apply to concepts like rep ranges, for example. A lot of people, tend to say, well, I'm just going to train across a variety of rep ranges because we don't know for sure that, there isn't some additional benefit from training, higher or lower reps. And whether that be, across a training session, across a week, across, different mesocycles, everyone sort of speculates differently on how that might interact. um, but just in general, people tend to agree that, there may be some synergy to be had when you're looking at, not just picking one option and sort of leaning into that 100%. I think we will start to see some more literature. I know there's some research being done now, just looking at, combining short partials with lengthened partials. So maybe doing half your sets of leg extensions at the top, half at the bottom, maybe how that compares, to training full range. So that's going to all be very interesting as we start to see that, those interactions across time. And you can also just see again from like, an ecological standpoint that like, um, after after sort of 100 years or so of plus, more than 100 years of like organized weight training and um, you know bodybuilding, that like people have leaned into sort of using a variety of exercises, and it hasn't just fallen to like, all right, we're just doing length and range. But you have actually seen a number of bodybuilders maybe bias sort of doing partial ranges, either from like a orthopedic perspective or possibly from just what they perceive as more stimulus. So it is important to just kind of observe where people have fallen over time, and you do see, a variety of exercises that both, seemingly bias shorter positions and longer positions, and you know, load them, in variable parts of the range as well.
Yeah, and I think if it's any consolation to people, guys for, all the Mr. Olympias for however long have grown their backs, and most of them were not doing, I mean, you could make the argument that some of them were in some sense, but, it's not exactly like bodybuilders have known forever how to do some kind of lengthened biased back related thing, right? Like most of the back training stuff that has been done for decades has all been, quote, short biased, just by, again, the nature of the implements and the nature of the constraints that normally come with back training, rowing, pulling down, those kinds of things. So if anyone was super convinced that, you needed to do lengthened partials to see any growth, there's plenty of evidence to suggest otherwise. And as Tom has told, both of us multiple times, clearly the profile is not, a limiting factor in people being able to see hypertrophy outcomes. But whether or not, we can say the same about other things like joint health and, that whole sort of, obviously joint health is kind of an esoteric concept in some way, like how do we define it? But I think most people know kind of what we mean when we talk about it. So a couple of the other things that I just wanted to make a commentary on that I think are relevant in what we can call the counter argument to going super deep into this direction is what I just mentioned about just sort of this concept of joint health. I think that, you know, much like the saying with great power comes great responsibility. Uh, with great tension comes potentially higher consequence. And so that's something to really consider in the context of, you know, specifically joints that are potentially more prone to extreme positions, which are, you know, pretty much all of them. Right. So, I would say the least potentially complicated might be, something like the elbow or something like the ankle, right, where we have harder structural stops, but something like the shoulder, the hip and end range position, potentially the spine and end range position, the knee, all those things, when we load them significantly more from a stretch based perspective, have to deal with more force, and generally at the extremes, dealing with more force, I think over a longer period, has potential downsides when we only really pay attention to that bit of the range. Just to use one example in the knee, the patellofemoral forces in the fully knee flexed or knee bent position are highest in terms of the compressive forces that you have to deal with, as compared to something like the short position, which may, in terms of how we're able to actually load it, potentially be something that is not only beneficial from the perspective of strengthening, we'll say, the shortened end of the range, but just actually being able to deal with force in that position from a joint perspective, I think lends to a stronger joint overall in terms of how the connective tissues are able to actually deal with force, and exposing connective tissues to different kinds of loading, I think is something that across, most bodybuilders we've ever seen is something that becomes more and more of a problem over time. The more hypertrophy that you get, the stronger that you get. So I think just this concept of joint health should be prioritized. And I've said before that, the health of your joints is kind of the prerequisite to being able to train and to grow. And so I think that although we do, see potentially more force and more output in these lengthened positions, with that comes the equal cost of the additional stress that we have to deal with. So more is more until more like can't be more, and until we find ourselves in a position where now all our fucking joints, feel like we're 80 years old, because we've neglected, all the exercises that would maybe train 50% of the range of motion that we haven't been training. So much like anything else, moving too far in one direction has consequences, and it's important to remember that. Another thing that I wrote down here is just this concept of, how we discussed, like, making an exercise super, super stretch from a muscle length perspective, but then also from a profile perspective, can often backfire in terms of the outcome that you're trying to achieve. And then also some other things related to skill acquisition. So a good example might be, like a cable curl, right? Where if you're facing away from the machine, what you can do is you can, anchor the cable as low as possible on the stack, and you can kind of step forward to make it heavier on the elbow in the bottom position, as compared to if you're sort of just next to the pulleys right there. Instead of just pulling downward more like a dumbbell, you can step forward and they're kind of stretching your arms backward. And so people will take this to the extreme and step like a mile away from the cable stack without the recognition that when you make it heavier on the elbow, you're also making it heavier on the shoulder by 2 times the distance, right? So people end up doing like this face away curl thing where they're putting twice the amount of torque on the shoulder joint and the associated tissues, as compared to the elbow, which was the thing that in the first place they were trying to load. So not only from a goal-based perspective in terms of loading the elbow, did you move farther away from the goal? But then in addition to that, even if you were in a position where, let's say, you put something behind, the back of your arm to prevent your shoulder from being a rate limiter, what you've now done is as you mentioned earlier, you have loaded, we'll say 10 to 20% of the range super substantially, and you've loaded the rest of the range pretty much not at all, or so insignificantly that we can say that that portion of the range was almost not even effectively trained, right? So again, to use this example of the curl, let's say you angle the cable precisely at 90 degrees from your hand and the bottom, and you support your, your elbow appropriately, so your shoulder is locked in, it's not moving. Even when you do those curls, you have a ton of length and you have a ton of load in the bottom position. But now all of a sudden you've neglected a large portion of the range, to where you've gone so far in the direction of loading the bottom that you've loaded now none of the mid range and none of the short position. Which again, as you're saying, if we're talking about area under the curve, we don't really understand quite at this point what the consequence of that might be. But immediately, I think we can just sort of logic our way through that and be like, okay, we're neglecting 80% of the range to train 20% of it. That doesn't seem probably like the best bet for a number of reasons. And the thing that sort of goes along with this is, and this is especially relevant, I think, in the context of personal training, is that when you bias a specific portion of a range of motion super heavily in terms of peak resistance, as in the instance I was just describing, you actually make it, in my experience, much more difficult for people to learn the motion and execute the motion appropriately, right? So in the example of making it super heavy in the bottom, and we see this a lot on super extreme like dumbbell variations, where there's basically 100% of the load at the bottom. I saw this guy the other day who was like leaning backwards on a bench, so his whole body was parallel to the floor, right? And his arms were also parallel to the floor, and so the dumbbell was 90 degrees. If you can imagine just like someone standing up and then just tipping them backward, right?
Do
At
you have
least
anything behind his arm? Because
his arm was on a bench. His arm was on the bench, so he was laying 90 degrees from a bench.
and his elbow was off of the bench. So
His elbow was off, but his distal humerus was on the bench.
yeah, yeah, okay.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of
Because
like he was
if
being,
you just took like an incline curl to its extreme,
yeah,
your arm would move perpendicular to the floor. But you're saying in this instance, like his arm was still supported.
yeah. It was
It
parallel
would
to
be
the
very
floor.
much like, doing a lateral raise lying on your side,
Yeah,
right? Where it's
yeah.
just like maximally heavy at the bottom and then just like drops off pretty.
Yeah. Like if you were just like, if you laid down on the floor side, like
Yeah.
on your side, and you had a dumbbell and you were holding it out to, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, it looked like there was an exorcism occurring, essentially.
This
This
is a
was,
great example of what we're talking about, where it's just like taken to its absolute most
yeah,
extreme.
right. So now you have, again, 10 to 20% of the range loaded at the bottom, and you have none of the range even close to the mid or the short position loaded there. And so what this creates, and anyone who is a personal trainer, even for, if you're a personal trainer for a week, you know that people are, generally speaking, not great at learning exercise, even in the context of appropriately set up physics for that exercise. And so what you do by drastically increasing the resistance at a small portion of the range and drastically reducing the resistance in a majority of the rest of the range is you introduce a lot of change in terms of what the person actually has to manage. So again, in the context of this like crucifix curl, in the bottom, it gets so heavy. And if you're dealing with someone who is not able to really consciously be able to control that increasing resistance, you end up in a situation where all other things start to move, like your shoulder starts to move, potentially the rest of the body starts to move. So in other words, it's just a lot more complex for people to, I think, learn motions that have drastically changing profiles. And you see this very clearly in something like a squat. If you're teaching someone to squat for the first time, a lot of people will lower down to a certain point. They'll be decent toward the mid range, and then they'll just sort of plop in the bottom portion of the range, right? That's an example of just a sort of maybe less extreme version of this, where you do have such an extreme difference in profile that it becomes very difficult for people to manage the drastic change in the resistance and the increased resistance that they're using toward a specific portion. Now, I think if you're dealing with people who are intermediate advanced, or whatever you want to call them, who really have a good sense of control and sort of are educated enough to understand where things are going to get heavier and lighter, that's where it's like changing the profile to be more biased in a specific direction can actually be very helpful for their learning, because then they're forced to sort of control things into a specific range. But I would say for a vast majority of people, that's not what I see. I don't see people doing this profile extreme and then executing it really appropriately and in a controlled way. I see people sort of getting slammed into particular positions rather than controlling motion into particular positions. And these tend to be positions, as we've discussed, that are more extreme and therefore more compromised from a structural standpoint, or just from a contraction based, standpoint. Both of those things sort of coming hand in hand in some ways. So I think those are some interesting points to be made. And I just kind of want to finish this ramble here with a specific anecdote of a comparison or another comparison, which was this person was basically recommending for quad based training that if you're going to choose a couple of quad motions, what you should do is you should do like some kind of partial squat, where you're like, just using the bottom, 30%, 40. And then for the rectus femoris, instead of doing leg extensions, you should do reverse Nordics, because reverse Nordics train a more lengthened position. And allegedly, these are more stable. This is a stable, alternative to, let's say, something like, a split squat or a standing sissy squat. And for those of you who don't know, a reverse Nordic is basically where you sit on your shins and your ankles and you lean backwards. So you're basically doing a leg extension where your body is moving instead of where your shin is moving. You can just think of it that way. And so this is, I think, is a really another good example of people moving too far to that extreme, wherein you are substituting an exercise which is highly stable, which is loaded tangentially, meaning it's loaded super appropriately for the knee, and where you have an ability to use different portions of the range. You have the ability to, use much higher loads relative to what you're able to handle maybe in the short position, or lighter loads relative to, the lengthened position. So you could train the full range, you could train a short partial, you can train the lengthened partial. You can do all sorts of things that are super versatile and super well set up for you. And you have replaced it with an exercise that is much more difficult to manage from a complexity standpoint, where you have all the trunk stuff going on that you have to manage. You have to basically do, isometric hip flexion the entire time. This is not even considering the fact that if you're at all jacked, it's really difficult to actually sit onto your shins. It's not accounting for the fact that it's probably very uncomfortable for anyone to actually sit on their ankles and smush their ankles into plantar flexion and their toes into toe flexion. It's not accounting for the fact that the patellofemoral mechanics might be compromised depending on what, how your knees relate to the actual pads. It's not accounting for the fact that it's very difficult to actually load and progress over time, right? So this is a perfect example of where you have ignored all other important variables, and you've taken this muscle length thing, and you've taken this resistance profile thing, and you've made a conclusion based on one or maybe two variables at the expense of all the other things that make, I think, a productive exercise selection. And that doesn't by any stretch mean that the reverse Nordic thing is bad or that you should never do it, but it just means that we shouldn't be throwing out exercises like the leg extension because, a couple of studies said this one thing, and we're going to make a strong conclusion based off of it. So those were kind of my, that is kind of me going full circle from the seated calf thing now to the quad thing, with all those different points sort of in between. And I could probably say more, but if you have any thoughts to sort of interject there, I'm interested to hear anything that came up for you.
No, I thought those are really useful anecdotes of where we've actually seen this uh, taken too far. It's like I hear people talking about it a lot, and I see a few examples, but like oftentimes, people are still sort of accidentally getting it right. A lot of times when we do set something up to be biased, heavy in the long position from a resistance profile standpoint, it does end up being pretty good, either because we just can't bias it that much. Oftentimes, you know, so I do think like in practice, sometimes you just end up being, accidentally right. Same thing with like the eccentrics and the pause and the lengthen position that we were talking about earlier. Even though it does kind of maybe the opposite sometimes of what people are thinking it does, it may end up just being net positive in terms of just being more sustainable, more survivable. So there are some times when, we're trying to create this bias and we have one thing in mind and maybe it works for a different reason, than we thought did. Um, yeah, I think that's like pretty comprehensive, on that topic. I don't know
Mhm.
how much that's like an hour or so at this point.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the only other thing that I maybe wanted to add to that is just, in the context of a changing profile and of changing resistance, it's important to remember that different muscles contribute more in different portions of a range of motion. So, for example, if you have the goal of training your biceps, but you are doing a curl that is only loaded in the most lengthened position, you are also going to have more relative involvement of the other elbow flexors in that position because of how the biceps are at a slight, mechanical disadvantage in that position. So that's just another thing that is ignored when you only focus on the length of one single tissue, is that there are other tissues that exist in the body. And if you ignore the length of those guys and the advantage and the muscular advantage of those guys, you may actually be, we'll say, targeting something, for lack of a better term, that you are not intending to target. And as a consequence of that, if you are applying that across all your exercises all the time, you end up in a position where maybe you've actually been loading primarily this muscle that you weren't really aware of that you were loading, for 6 months, and then you're confused about like why your exercise selection is not really creating the intended or the desired outcome that you thought, despite the fact that, oh, you've made it heavy in this lengthened position. You've ignored, all the other factors or some of the other factors that may, sort of serve as a response to those changes that you've made. So, yeah, I think that's probably a good place to call it. I'm very interested to kind of see, in the next year or so where this conversation goes and what new research comes out that sort of wakes people up to this, because I do think that this is going to be one of those things that there are only a couple people right now that are really talking about the message that is, that we're talking about right now. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens as a sort of turning point, or what forces people to wake up to the fact that, there are other things to consider in this conversation. Because like all other kinds of these sorts of novel opinions that come from research, I think they will come and go, but I'm curious to see what the thing is that sort of makes it go, if that makes sense. I'm hoping it's not something that is uh painful or problematic for people directly, meaning I hope that people don't just start to get injured left and right, although I think that's what's gonna another point to be made is like, maybe there's a lot of people who don't necessarily train super hard to begin with, and so it's not going to be a huge problem anyway. But we'll stay up to date on the modern meathead experience. And yeah, this officially marks, by the way, I think episode 26 or something, which, if my math is correct, is about half a year of podcasts, which is pretty cool, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's been that long,
No,
right?
it doesn't.
No. Yeah.
Wow.
All right, cool.